Colleen Ashworth backed her flatbed trailer up to the gate of her family's place outside Willow Springs, Missouri, on a Tuesday morning in June of 2011, and watched a truck from the Ozarks Veneer company tip its bed and drop 4 tons of peeler cores onto the ground she'd spent the last decade trying to farm around. The cores rolled and settled into an uneven pile, hundreds of them, pale round sticks of leftover poplar and sweet gum left over after the Veneer mill had shaved the good wood off each log in a continuous ribbon, leaving behind a skinny, knotty core that was too small and too irregular for the mill to do anything else with. The driver didn't get out to apologize for where it landed. He just knocked the load loose, gave a short wave, and pulled back out onto the county road, same as he'd been doing every other week for the better part of a year, ever since Colleen had asked the mill's yard foreman if she could start taking the cores instead of letting them get chipped for mulch. Colleen Ashworth was 39 years old that June, running 60 acres of hay and a small cow-calf operation on land her grandfather had homesteaded, land that had carried the family through some lean years but had never once made anybody rich, and hadn't been getting any easier since her husband's off-farm job at the co-op had been cut back to part-time the year before. The hay ground covered the note most years, barely, and the cow-calf side brought in just enough on top of that to keep the operation from sliding backward, but there wasn't much room in a year like that for anything extra, and Colleen had gotten used to looking hard at every dollar that left the place before it went. She wasn't a woodworker by trade, didn't have a shop full of tools or a lifetime of carpentry behind her, but she had a garden that fed her family through most of the year, a half-acre plot behind the house that she'd expanded twice since she and her husband had taken over the place from his parents, and she had a problem that garden kept handing her every single spring, which was that decent wooden stakes, the kind that would hold up a tomato plant or a row of beans through a whole growing season without snapping or rotting through by August, cost more at the farm store than she liked to spend on something that ought to be simple. Let me tell you about the Ozarks Veneer Company, because you need to understand what those peeler cores actually represented before you understand why Colleen wanted them. The mill had been running a rotary veneer line outside Willow Springs since the early 1990s, buying up sweet gum and poplar logs from loggers across 3 counties and peeling them down into thin sheets of veneer used for furniture backing and plywood facing, a process that leaves almost nothing of the original log untouched except one thing, the core. Once a log gets peeled down past a certain diameter, usually somewhere around 4 to 6 inches, it can't be held steady on the lathe anymore, and what's left gets kicked out the far end of the machine as scrap. For a mill running that line at full production, the cores piled up fast, more than the mulch chippers could always keep pace with, and for years the standard solution had simply been to let contractors haul truckloads of it away for free just to keep the yard clear. Colleen had first noticed the cores on a delivery run past the mill in the spring of 2010, a pile of them sitting along the fence line waiting to be chipped, straight-grained, mostly knot-free for the first several feet, already roughly the diameter of a fence post. She'd pulled over, walked the pile for a few minutes, and driven home with 3 cores in the bed of her truck just to see what she could do with them. What she did that first summer wasn't much. She cut a handful into rough 4-foot lengths with a bow saw, pointed one end with a hatchet, and used them in her own garden instead of buying stakes from the farm store that spring. They held up fine. They held up better than fine, actually, because sweet gum and poplar, once they've dried out, turn out to be tougher and more rot-resistant than the thin pine stakes sold at most farm stores, which are milled from young, fast-grown plantation pine that doesn't have much natural durability to begin with. She went back to the mill that fall and asked the yard foreman, a man who'd been running that end of the operation for going on 15 years, whether she could come get cores on a regular basis instead of just picking through what was sitting by the fence. He said sure, take what she wanted, the mill wasn't using it for anything and it saved them a chipping run. That arrangement ran informal and free for almost a year, Colleen driving over every few weeks with her own trailer, cutting and pointing stakes by hand in the evenings after fieldwork, selling small bundles of them at the Willow Springs Farmers Market on Saturday mornings for a few dollars a bundle, mostly to other gardeners who'd heard from a neighbor that the Ashworth stakes held up better than what the farm store carried. Now let me pause here and ask you something, because it matters to what happened next. How many people do you think drove past that same pile of peeler cores every week on their way into that mill, and never once thought to stop the truck and look closer? The mill had been generating that exact same waste for the better part of 20 years before Colleen ever pulled over. By the spring of 2011, Colleen had sold enough stakes at the farmer's market and fielded enough requests from people who wanted more than she could cut by hand in her spare evenings that she decided to formalize things. She went back to the mill, this time asking to speak with the plant manager directly rather than just the yard foreman, and proposed a standing arrangement. The mill would set cores aside for her specifically, twice a month, and she'd take the full volume instead of just picking through the pile. The plant manager, a practical man who cared mostly about keeping his yard clear and his disposal costs down, agreed to a 10-year handshake arrangement on the spot, mostly because it cost him nothing and solved a problem he'd been dealing with for 2 decades. She mentioned the new arrangement to a few people at the Willow Springs Co-op that same week, standing at the counter waiting on a feed order, and a man named Delbert Cranston, who'd run a small sawmill of his own outside town for close to 30 years before retiring, overheard her explaining it to the clerk. Delbert had opinions about peeler core wood, and he shared them without much prompting. He told Colleen that peeler cores were about the lowest grade of wood a mill produced, full of knots and reaction wood, prone to checking as it dried, and that she'd be better off buying pressure-treated lumber and cutting proper stakes than betting a business on scrap nobody in the timber trade would touch. He wasn't cruel about it, just certain, the way a man is certain about something he's watched fail before in some form or another. A couple of the other men at the counter nodded along. Colleen thanked him for the advice, picked up her feed order, and went home. What Delbert Cranston didn't know, because Colleen hadn't explained the details, was that she wasn't trying to build furniture-grade lumber out of peeler cores. She was solving a much simpler problem. A garden stake doesn't need to be knot-free or perfectly straight-grained. It needs to hold a plant upright through one growing season without snapping, and ideally survive a few winters in the ground without rotting through, and sweet gum and poplar core wood, once properly dried, did both of those things better than the cheap pine stakes that dominated the farm store shelves. The market Colleen was actually stepping into wasn't the lumber trade Delbert had spent his career in. It was the home garden supply market, a market full of people who cared much more about a stake that wouldn't snap under a heavy tomato vine in August than about whether the grain ran perfectly straight. There was a cost gap underneath all of it too, one Colleen had worked out mostly by comparing farm store shelf tags against what she knew the mill was already throwing away. A bundle of 10 milled pine stakes at the farm store in Willow Springs ran close to $8 that year, cut from young plantation pine that had to be grown, harvested, and milled specifically for that purpose. A peeler core, by contrast, was a byproduct the Veneer mill had already paid to grow, haul, and process once, for an entirely different purpose, and the only cost left in turning it into a stake was the labor of cutting, drying, and pointing it. Nobody else in that part of the Ozarks was positioned to see both sides of that gap at once, the garden store shelf price on one end and the mill scrap pile on the other, which is exactly why it had sat there unclaimed for 2 decades before Colleen pulled her truck over. Her first real wholesale sale came that same summer, to a garden center in West Plains that had been buying bundled stakes from a distributor 2 states away and paying a price that left them little margin once shipping was factored in. Colleen drove over with a sample bundle, 40 stakes cut to a uniform 4 feet and pointed on a small bench grinder she'd rigged up in the barn, and the garden center's owner, after testing a few by hand and finding them heavier and stiffer than what she'd been buying, placed an order for 200 stakes on the spot at a price that worked out to just under $1.50 each. Colleen's material cost, once the twice-monthly core pickups were counted, ran to about 11 cents a stake. Word moved through that part of the Ozarks about as fast as it always does, one garden center telling another, one county extension agent mentioning it at a meeting to somebody from the next county over. By the end of 2012, Colleen had wholesale accounts with 6 garden centers and farm supply stores across 3 counties, had brought her husband on part-time once his hours at the co-op had thinned out further, and had built a simple pole barn workshop with a proper debarking setup and a gas-powered pointer machine that could process a stake in under 10 seconds instead of the 2 minutes it had taken by hand that first summer. Revenue for 2012 came in at just under $26,000, against a material cost that stayed close to nothing, since the mill's cores were still coming free under the original handshake arrangement. The growth kept climbing through the years that followed, steady rather than explosive, the kind of growth that comes from one satisfied wholesale account telling another rather than from any single dramatic break. By 2015, Colleen had accounts across 7 counties and had added a second product line, heavier 6-foot cores split and pointed for use as light fence posts and trellis supports, sold to small hobby farms and vineyard operations that needed something sturdier than a garden stake but didn't want to pay full lumberyard prices for pressure-treated posts. Revenue that year crossed $90,000. She'd hired 2 part-time employees from town to help with the cutting and bundling during the busy spring season, and the pole barn had grown a second bay to keep up with drying capacity, since cores needed a solid season of air drying before they were ready to cut and point without splitting. She kept a plain record book through all of it, the way her grandfather had kept one for the hay operation, noting how many cores came in each pickup, how many finished stakes and posts went out each month, and which accounts were ordering steadily versus which had slowed down. By the end of 2016, that book showed sales to 11 wholesale accounts, a mail order sideline she'd started almost by accident after a garden blogger featured her steaks in a post about sustainable garden supplies, and a growing pile of unfilled requests from accounts further out that she didn't yet have the drying capacity to serve. Then, in the fall of 2017, the arrangement that had made the whole business possible nearly came apart. The Ozarks Veneer Company was purchased by a regional building products conglomerate that fall, and the new ownership brought in efficiency consultants who looked at every line item in the mill's operation, including the informal handshake deal that had been quietly handing a local woman 4 tons of scrap wood every month for free. A representative from the new ownership called Colleen that October and told her the cores would either need to be paid for going forward, at a rate the mill's accountants had worked out based on shipping and disposal costs they'd been avoiding, or the arrangement would end entirely and the cores would go back to the chipper the way they had before Colleen ever showed up. Colleen spent 2 weeks running her own numbers before she called back. What she found was that even at the new proposed rate, roughly $40 a ton, her material cost per stake would still land well under the price her competitors paid for raw pine lumber, because a peeler core produced far more usable stake length per dollar than a milled board did. She called the representative back and agreed to the new rate without much negotiation, mostly because the math still worked comfortably in her favor, and because she understood, in a way the new ownership apparently hadn't considered, that she'd built the only reliable buyer that mill's peeler cores had ever had. Delbert Cranston came by the pole barn the following spring, mostly out of curiosity after hearing from someone at the co-op that Colleen's operation had grown considerably since the day he'd warned her off scrapwood at the counter. He walked the drying yard slowly, picked up a finished steak from a bundle waiting on the loading dock, turned it over in his hands the way a man who'd spent 30 years around a sawmill naturally does, and admitted that he'd been thinking about not counting grain quality, the things that mattered in the lumber trade he knew, and hadn't once considered that a garden steak was solving an entirely different problem. Colleen told him that was about the size of it. Delbert didn't argue. Colleen Ashworth's operation, which she'd started calling Ashworth Garden Supply somewhere around 2014 without much ceremony, crossed $350,000 in annual revenue by the end of 2023, 12 years after that first trailer load of free peeler cores landed in a pile by her gate. She still buys cores from the same mill, now under a formal contract instead of a handshake, still runs the operation out of the same pole barn her husband helped her build, and still sells stakes and light posts to garden centers and small farms across a dozen counties, built entirely out of wood that an entire timber industry had spent decades treating as something with no use beyond the chipper. Her husband works the operation full-time now, the co-op job left behind for good somewhere around 2016, and their oldest daughter has started spending her summers in the pole barn learning the pointer machine and the record book both, the same way Colleen learned to look past what a pile of wood was supposed to be worth and toward what it could actually do. The pile of peeler cores still shows up twice a month, same as it always has, and Colleen still walks it the same way she did that first afternoon in 2010, looking for the straightest, cleanest lengths before the rest go into the drying racks. What everyone else along that county road saw for 20 years as scrap sitting by a fence line, she saw as a stake that just hadn't been cut yet.